It was good fun.
But nicht gespottet.
No,
We aren't famous enough to be spotted.
yeah.
We aren't famous enough to be spotted.
Yeah.
I think we'll.
Now it's live, it's starting in the UK.
Hello everybody and welcome to this lunch chat from UK in a Changing Europe. I'm Joël Rutter, I'm a senior research fellow here and I am joined by a top UKICE team to bring you the latest news on the subject, well almost the subject of the week, which is the UK's famous reset with the EU. We had Keir Starmer in Brussels on Monday being allowed into dinner with the 27. We had Nick Thomas-Symonds speaking on Tuesday and meeting Maroš Šefčovič today. We've actually now got a date for the first UK-EU summit on the 19th of May. If you haven't seen that, that's breaking news. And our top team were doing the hard yards in Brussels. So they're going to bring you sort of updates from the front. And I'm joined by Anand Menon, Jannike Wachowiak, Joël Reland, and unfortunately not making it to Brussels because she had to teach some students, Professor Catherine Barnard of the University of Cambridge. You all know the form, post questions galore on Slido, and I am going to kick off with a few of my own, but I will weave yours in. If the questions appeal to you, then upvote them rather than put in something that looks very similar. So there is power in numbers. Might is right, as Donald Trump might say. Anyway, let's get going. Anand, if you're there. Can't see Anand at the moment, but I'm sure he's lurking around. Oh, that's very reassuring. So the mood in Brussels, I'm not sure how long it was since you were last in Brussels, but did you detect a distinct warmth towards the UK? What's the mood music going on there? And how much attention is the EU, as opposed to the UK, paying to the proposed reset?
I mean, the mood is one of warmth. I don't remember Theresa May getting applauded after her interventions at dinners such as the one that Keir Starmer attended, and he apparently did. At the EU-UK Forum conference yesterday, a lot of positive thoughts around. I still think hovering in the background on the EU side is a sense of frustration at the fact that 6 months in, all they've heard is reset, and they've heard very little in the way of detail. And you're absolutely right, Jill. I imagine today, now we've all come back home, the EU are getting on with what they see as their priorities, and we're not one of those priorities.
Okay, Jannike, Keir Starmer was talking quite a bit about defence and security, and for some time we had the impression that was actually relatively easy to progress relatively quickly. It's something that the EU had wanted before. Should we be expecting a big new defence and security pact to be unveiled at the 19th of May summit? Is that what we're heading for? And what might it cover if there is progress on that?
So I think we need to probably distinguish between foreign policy coordination on the one hand, and then the whole kind of defense and security cooperation, and particularly defense industrial cooperation. So I think on foreign policy, we've actually already seen some progress. So David Lammy and the High Representative have already agreed to meet every 6 months to discuss kind of areas of mutual interest when it comes to foreign policy. So we've already seen some kind of progress in that area. When Starmer came over to Brussels on Monday to join EU leaders for their dinner, they particularly discussed the security situation in Europe, Ukraine, the impact of Trump. And I think there, Keir Starmer actually outlined a few areas where he's interested in more cooperation, and defense industrial collaboration is one of those. And I think that's going to be one of those areas where we're not going to see any quick progress for various reasons. One of those reasons is that actually on the EU side, the EDA program, so the European Defence Industrial Program, is still in its early days. There are still questions around whether member states will actually put significant money behind those proposals that the European Commission made. And then if they do, there is a question around whether they will allow third countries outside the single market, so a country like the United Kingdom, to actually participate in those programs. And so there is a question mark around whether Keir Starmer will be able to persuade EU leaders to allow the UK to kind of contribute and participate in these programs. So I think when it comes to those areas, it's still early days, and I don't expect any results in this area on the 19th of May. I think what we could see would be some sort of non-binding high-level statement just outlining kind of joint ambitions. But I think kind of the more difficult defense stuff will probably be kicked down the road.
And just a sort of thing that seemed to surface, which was the French suddenly saying, we can't do defence and security cooperation without assurances that we won't lose any further ground on fishing rights. Did you detect very much sympathy from other member states for linking, frankly, an extraordinarily trivial part of the EU economy, only of interest to a few coastal member states, with something that seems much more existential? It doesn't seem an obvious linkage.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is that there are politics on both sides. I mean, I think from the EU's perspective, probably they are also thinking, well, you know, Labour's red lines seem very political and are kind of constraints on what is possible. And obviously that is for political reasons, because people in the EU do also understand that, you know, Labour wants to be cautious that in terms of public opinion in the UK, even though people think that Brexit isn't going particularly well, it's not as if a majority of people or Leave voters would vote differently. And they are worried about kind of seats in the north of England and so on. So all of that has a political background in terms of how the UK is positioning itself. And I think the same is true for France and other coastal member states, that they have their own constituencies. And if you look at France and Brittany and Normandy and the fishermen there, whilst it might not be an important economic area, it is very important politically. So I think it's just politics that's playing into it from both sides, really. And I think what we're seeing on the EU side at the moment is the same what we saw during the TCA negotiations, that EU unity is kind of being put front and center. And I do think that even though member states do think that it's important to cooperate more closely with the UK and they want a closer relationship, that I think they will still prioritize EU unity in those discussions. So there might be some kind of internal maybe dissatisfaction about certain French positions, but I do still think that they will stick together.
Interesting. Joel, where do you think we were on sort of other things that the UK's floated, things like a veterinary agreement? I think we've seen some stuff on linking emission trading schemes and more energy cooperation, the famous creative touring artists and recognition for professional qualification. Anything, any straws in the wind that you got while you were in Brussels picked up about enthusiasm for meeting the UK on any of those?
Yeah, so I think one of the consistent, criticisms that we've made of the UK's approach has been the lack of clarity on exactly what they want. And ultimately, you can't start a negotiation until you're very clear to the EU which are the items that you want to put on the table. And that's how you get things going. So yeah, we're trying to distill that. And I think what you can see that's interesting from Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Minister for EU Relations intervention yesterday and also last week at our own event, was he now talks about three pillars of the relationship: security, which is defense; safety, which is migration and kind of cooperating on issues like small boats; and then prosperity, which is the trading relationship. And so to me, this suggests that Labour's policy framework is evolving in relation to opinion polls more than anything else, because the only real reason I can see for that safety pillar coming into it is that if you poll people on what do they most want to do with the EU, it's improve the trade relationship and it's combat sort of issues to do with migration. So to me, that suggests that they are still very much led from domestic perceptions of how their EU policy will play out. And I'm not necessarily sure that is the most constructive way to go about your negotiation, because I think what the EU is after is, rather than more strands and pillars and highfalutin talk about the ways in which this reset is working is the substantial what do you want to talk about? And there, I'm still not so sure. We've now got emissions trading, was sort of briefed to the FT last week as being something that's on the table. I think it would be a really obvious thing to focus on because of both the economic benefits and the fact that it's in the treaty. So it's something you can do quite obviously without opening up lots of political debate. But where's that come from? Why is that now suddenly emerging? I'm still sort of, there's a lot more heat than light about exactly where this is going. And I guess for the sake of a successful reset, you hope that by May and the time of this summit, that it will be drilled down into a lot more detail.
Catherine, we've talked quite a lot about what the UK might want, but we know that one of the EU's asks, maybe this is just an obsession of the German ambassador, but it does seem to go a bit further than that, is for a youth mobility scheme. And I heard the BBC's political correspondent yesterday morning at some ungodly hour saying this is reintroducing free movement for young people. What exactly might a youth mobility scheme really look like? Where are we on that? Do we have specific proposals now from the EU if they moved on from their initial unhelpful ones?
Thank you. Yes, so there were these proposals that you mentioned back in May. They were extremely ambitious. The timing was dreadful. The Conservatives immediately said no way. Labour quickly followed suit with a view to knocking all of this on the head. I think it's deeply unhelpful if anything is to be achieved to link it with free movement. It is absolutely not free movement. Free movement envisages the right to stay on a permanent basis. It's visa free. It envisages the right, you can bring your family members, and the right to have access to social welfare benefits in the host state. None of those will be under a youth mobility scheme. It will be time limited. It will be subject to visas. It will be subject probably to having a minimum income, and you will not have access to the social welfare system. So the two things should not be conflated. There are political interests to conflate the two, but they are entirely different. The question then is what can be delivered, and the really thorny issue is universities. So the EU is very keen indeed to have access to British universities on terms as they had prior to Brexit, which means paying home fees rather than overseas fees, which is what they're paying at the moment. And this is a big ask, particularly at a time when British universities, as we've seen, are really struggling for funds. And of course, it's asymmetrical too, because it's far more likely for Lithuanians and Latvians to want to come to the UK than UK nationals wanting to go to those countries because of the obvious language issue. We've heard very recently Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying no to youth mobility. I suspect down the line there will be some concessions there, but it won't be called youth mobility. It will be called something like a cultural exchange scheme or youth experience scheme. It will be repackaged, but nevertheless, it is a big ask for the Germans. The Germans are really leading the way on this. And it's become almost totemic in the way that we can rattle off almost in our sleep the UK asks over touring musicians and SPS and the like. For the EU, it's youth mobility and fish. And so it's likely that something will have to be given down the line. The other thing that's interesting that we're seeing at the moment is the EU talking about all of this as a package. And this is what we saw over the withdrawal agreement and the TCA negotiations. You can't agree, say, something nice on emissions trading without the other asks on both sides being considered.
That's really interesting. Anand, why do you think, we've got a question here, a couple of questions. One about why is Labour so sceptical about a youth mobility scheme, and will that ultimately get in the way? And a second question just about this from Elliot Robertson. Hi, Elliot. About what Catherine was just saying about, is this going to be a nothing is agreed until everything's agreed, or would we expect to see dossiers, chapters progressing more quickly, maybe particularly on defence and security. And I want to discuss the difference that Donald Trump is going to make in a second. So, Anand, what do you reckon? I mean, why is Labour so unkeen on youth mobility? Is that negotiating tactics? It's the only thing the EU wants, so we have to play hard to get? Or is it a substantive set of objections to that?
I think broadly there are three more or less substantive problems with it. The first is the Home Office. And the Home Secretary has made it very clear that she's unwilling to see this done because she doesn't want more people coming to the country. She's worried about the immigration numbers. Now, it strikes me there's a fight going on in government about this, which is something we've got used to over, well, forever, because there's always a fight between the Home Office and other departments about this. So, I mean, that's the first thing. The second is the general caution of the Labour Party on this particular dossier, the EU, because of a fear of reform and a desire to win back reform voters, which we can talk about if you like, because it's conceivable that fear is overblown. But anyway, that's really enough. And I think linked to that is the sort of political project that some at the centre of the Labour Party think they're engaged in. And a key bit of that is winning back their traditional working class voters, particularly though not only in those red wall seats. One of the most remarkable things about the last election is that whilst Labour won all those seats back, they actually didn't increase their vote share amongst working class voters. And if they did, it was by a trivial amount. They won because the Conservatives were really unpopular. And I think the sensitivity over youth mobility amongst some in the Labour Party is that this is just seen, as free movement was seen by some people, as a perk for the professional class at the expense of blue collar workers. You know, my kids can go to university in continental Europe. I can go and give lectures in continental Europe. Meanwhile, the plumber down the road faces competition. And they're quite sensitive to that line of argument, I think, which is why the way this thing is presented matters so much. I thought peak European Commission was the stage a few months ago when the Commission suggested we could call it a gap year, which is almost as bad as it could get in terms of framing for the government. But I think, you know, if you call it a work opportunity scheme or something like that and make it clear that it's as open to people doing apprentices as it is to people doing master's degrees, I think that might get a bit more traction. So it's partly just how this is packaged, I think.
Okay, Jannike, you wanted to come in on this. Maybe you can give us the view from the German mindset of why it's so important. And is it as important to Friedrich Merz if he becomes Chancellor as it appears to be to the current government?
Well, let me start by adding something to what Anand just said in terms of the British debate. So I think it's quite interesting. There was a debate in the House of Commons a week or a couple of weeks ago on youth mobility, which was initiated by a Lib Dem MP. And it was quite interesting to see that debate because I think you can kind of see that even people in the UK who are in favour of a youth mobility deal did not particularly like everything that was in the Commission's proposal. And one of the things that kind of came out of the debate was that one of the UK's ask might be that actually the Commission's proposal was that young Brits would be able to only go to one EU member state without the right of onward movement. So you couldn't go first to Germany and then to France. You could only would have to like choose one member state to go to. And that's something that I think some on the British side who are in favour of a youth mobility scheme think would be unfair and something they would like to negotiate. And then the other aspect is what Anand already mentioned in terms of apprenticeships. I think there's a very strong sense that this shouldn't be just an elitist scheme, but that this should focus on different kind of types of professions and people and not just university students. So I think that's going to be kind of, because I'm sure there is going to be some sort of negotiation on youth mobility, and I think those are probably going to be some of the kind of things that the UK is going to try to push for, I imagine. In terms of the German position, I think there's just, well, it's an important ask because I think a lot of young German people like to go to the UK. Simple as that. I think it's also something that a lot of the German Bundesländer are pushing for. So it's something where just there's a lot of pressure on the German government to do something on. I don't think that will change if and when Friedrich Merz comes in. I mean, the Conservatives, the CDU, have already said that they would also be in favour in continuing negotiations with the UK on a bilateral kind of friendship treaty, which is kind of a bit on hold at the moment because of the German election. So I think we would largely see continuity in the relationship with Germany.
So Joel, everything has to be agreed before anything is agreed. Do you expect that? Or do you think we will see peeling off individual dossiers? Do you get any sense for how negotiations might be structured, the timetable, and how this links into some of the real deadlines we have in 2026 on energy and fish, and that sort of, much famed TCA review? How does this all work out?
Yeah, I think for the EU, there's definitely a desire to do everything agreed at the same time, because that's what strengthens their negotiating hand. Ultimately, it's the UK that's making most of the asks, that wants, the majority of the changes. Therefore, the EU can kind of hold them to more or less ransom, not in a particularly, negative sense like that, but that's ultimately, they need to get what they want out of it before they're willing to sign off on the UK elements. And I mean, something like Fisheries is really indicative of that, because Fisheries isn't really part of the reset. It's already in the TCA. It's already part of the treaties. It needs to come up for renegotiation. It's something which really should be serviced to the side of this discussion, but they're bringing it in because that's where they have interest and that's where they can exert leverage. And it's the same, and youth mobility then is the other kind of key card they're going to play. So I think broadly speaking, yeah, we're going to have those things packaged up together. And I think there's an important lesson for the UK government to take from Theresa May, in particular, her experience of trying to negotiate with the EU the first time, where she laid all of her cards on the table very, very early and boxed herself in with very little room for maneuver once she'd said that basically customs union and single market was off the table. So you could say that actually gives some merit to the UK kind of being very quiet at the moment and not really specifying its arse too clearly out loud, because maybe if you go too far, you do limit your negotiating bandwidth. But at the same time, I also think that needs to be balanced against showing that you have clarity of thought and that you understand the issues that you really want to take forward. So it's very possible that a lot is going on behind the scenes that we're not quite privy to in terms of this UK negotiating tactic. But yeah, they're going to have to think hard about how they get leverage when it's them that are making most of the asks, and whether they can sort of isolate particular deals. I don't know how you would sort of go about doing that, but that would definitely be something to think about.
Okay, I was going to come on to Donald Trump, but first Catherine wants to come in on sand eels and puffins. So Catherine, talk sand eels, and then I'll get on to Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
The two facts are largely unrelated, I should say. That so the reason I want to mention sand eels is to pick up on a couple of the points that you and Joel raised earlier, which is about fishing. Now, as you say, fishing is very small fry, so to speak, in terms of economics, but in terms of what it means politically, it's hugely significant, particularly in respect to those states which fish in the waters around the UK coast, which brings me to sand eels. So sand eels, for those who are not familiar with them, are a keystone species, crucial for the diet of kittiwakes, puffins, harbour porpoises and others. And the UK, I should say separately, England and Scotland, consulted about banning fishing for sand eels in the British waters, and indeed, after extensive consultation, that went through. And the EU, prompted by Denmark, which does most of the fishing for sand eels, brought the first set of proceedings against the UK under the TCA, under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The case was heard last week, 3 days, where it was considered whether the UK was in fact in breach. Now, in fact, apart from the sand eels, there is really no very good outcome from this decision, because if the arbitration panel finds in favour of the UK, that obviously is good news for the sand eel, good news for the UK and for the environment, but not a whole lot of good news for our negotiations with the EU, because a lot of people on the EU side will say, look, we signed up to fishing quotas for sand eels and we appear to have reneged on them. If we lose the case, then it's also bad news because we'll have to decide what we want to do about it. The official answer is, of course, we'll have to let the Danes fish, but of course that will precipitate a very strong reaction by environmentalists and lots of people in England and Scotland. And so that means we would be subject to tariffs if we don't comply. And of course, tariffs is a beautiful word, as we know from Mr. Trump. And so it would be extraordinary at a time when the US is trying to put tariffs on the EU and possibly the UK, that the EU is also putting tariffs on the UK over sand eels.
Okay, and what would they put tariffs on? I mean, sand eels aren't a very major industry for anyone.
Yeah, so usually it's tariffs on in the same sector, and if that there are good reasons why that doesn't work, you can do cross-sector retaliation. And what the EU is very good at is working out where to impose tariffs which have maximum visibility, maximum political impact, but not necessarily disproportionate. So they could put tariffs on, say, Scottish smoked salmon.
I'd just like to put it out there now that there will be a headline that says "puff in hell" at some point in the next 6 months.
I was going to say, I think it could be a pork market situation, because I'm pretty sure what they fish the sand eels for is cheap protein to feed the pigs, which they then export. So if you say we're damaging the pork industry, then suddenly that's tariffs on UK meat and dairy exports would be maybe a logical place to go with it.
Okay, maybe not the best backdrop for doing a veterinary agreement. So you're all talking tariffs, so let's talk perhaps even bigger tariffs here. Stephen has asked, how does Keir Starmer get a balance between avoiding cozying up to Trump, resetting relations with the EU, but not invoking tariffs in the US? Not sure that's quite right, but anyway, but you get the gist there. Does the emergence of Trump and Musk staging what Sarah County describes as a coup on US institutions, does that speed change the context of the reset? Anand, you're a professor of world politics, etc., etc., etc. So how does the Trump-Musk first 3 weeks, however long they've been around for, how does that change things? Does it get a sense that people are actually rethinking the whole thing with the UK because of Trump? And how do you think Keir Starmer's playing his hand with this desire not to choose between the EU and the US?
Well, let me start parochial on that and then pan out. One thing it has immediately changed is the way the Liberal Democrats approach the issue of Europe. Since the election of Trump, the Lib Dems have been far more vocal on the issue of Europe. They've come forward with this deal about joining some sort of customs arrangement with the European Union. And Ed Davey has been able to go out and say the kinds of things about Donald Trump that most Labour MPs think, but they're not allowed to say because they're in government. And the official line is we have to stay close to the Americans as well. So how that plays out in the medium term, Sophie from our team's got a really good blog coming out on our site soon about the Lib Dems. But I think that's going to be really interesting to watch. If that gains traction and the Lib Dems gain support from it, it might be something that makes Number 10 take notice, but we'll see. More broadly, I think, on the one hand, yes, on both sides, because of Donald Trump's threats about Ukraine and blandishments about defense spending, it means that both sides see an increased urgency about security cooperation to figure out what to do if they're left having to police a Ukrainian peace deal, or if they have to figure out how to make Europe more self-sufficient in the military sphere. But, and it's a big but, for the UK specifically, whilst the Prime Minister is very keen to say, as he said very clearly at Mansion House, we will not have to choose, the danger is that Trump confronts us with a choice that says, for instance, well, look, if you play nicely with us, you can avoid tariffs. Then on the European side, I'm sure there'll be some who are thinking, hang on a sec, you want a reset, and yet you're on the wrong side of this debate. I mean, think back to de Gaulle in the early 1960s when he rejected our first application for membership, and he said the UK will be a Trojan horse for American interests in Europe. I can see some in some countries, not least France, saying, well, hang on a sec, we expect a little bit of loyalty here. Or even more sort of starkly, if the Americans say, look, we've got a really nice military and intelligence relationship with you, you'd really like to keep it, wouldn't you? But if you would, you're going to have to start buying some more American kit and forget these ideas about creating European competitors. That also puts us in a really difficult situation. I mean, as is true with every question about Trump, the honest answer is we don't know. I don't know what he's going to do because I suspect he doesn't know what he's going to do. But there are real potential traps here, I think, for the government.
Okay, interesting. Anyone else want to come in on Trump and context? Jannike, what are you picking up in terms of that? Maybe I could link it actually to a question from Mark English. Mark has said the EU wants strategic autonomy, defence critical raw materials, medicines, clean tech, capital markets union. He's asked whether that increases the cost to the UK of being outside. But, you know, in this sort of EU trying to batten down the hatches, we know that Donald Trump has described it as an atrocity. Does that mean that it's actually harder for the UK as a non-member state, or actually does it give the UK a sort of sweet spot, best of both worlds position, if we can make that hold?
I mean, I think as Anand says, the problem is that it's quite unpredictable. How things will develop. I think when it comes to kind of having to invest more in Europe's ability to kind of defend Europe without American support, or with less American support. I think the difficulty is that the question isn't just about where does the money come from, but this question of where are we going to spend the money. And to reference someone much smarter than me, Julian King, who spoke at the EU-UK forum yesterday, and what he said I thought was quite interesting, that it's quite nuanced if you think about, well, one question is, does the UK want to buy more American weapons and equipment to appease Trump, or do we just buy American weapons and equipment to fill certain gaps that we have? So is it a more nuanced approach? Or is it about buying American weapons if those are built in Europe, and if the UK wants to be part of European initiatives, and if these European initiatives are going in the kind of French direction, and there is a kind of buy in Europe logic to it, how is that going to work out? Is there a choice to be made then? And does the UK then actually want to participate in those European initiatives? And also at the same time, is the EU actually willing to open up those initiatives to the UK? So I think there are so many kind of open, unanswered questions in this area at the moment that it's very difficult to know where it's going to go.
Oh, very interesting. Anyone else want to come in on the wider relationship? Joel?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on kind of more the tariffs question, and this notion that the UK can occupy a sweet spot, I think is quite challenging, because ultimately, you know, the economic argument for Brexit is premised on a world in which you have free trade, which is broadly working sort of in the liberal notion of it. So the UK is able to sign agreements with the EU, but also with partners like America. And ultimately, the economic policy which Trump creates disorder and chaos and unpredictability. And when you are a small island sort of off the coast of the Atlantic, you know, you're likely to get buffeted by those headwinds, even if you think you can occupy sort of a niche within those forces. I think it's more likely that you're going to get blowback, and that's going to create disruption. And to give just one tangible example of that, I think we need to think about Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is subject to the EU's external tariff policy. So if you suddenly have US tariffs on EU goods, the EU retaliates with tariffs on US exports, Northern Ireland is going to have to levy those tariffs at its border, including if it's coming through GB. So it's just going to create more friction in that Northern Ireland situation, which we've finally been able to calm down. And I think that serves as something of a metaphor analogy for kind of the wider disruption that you get. There are always unforeseen consequences and intricacies which you don't sort of think about rationally in advance, but they just emerge. And so a chaotic global trading order, I think, is just bad news for a UK that's trying to build friendships on either side of the Atlantic.
And Joel, just to pick up on things, you produce our excellent divergence tracker, looking at where UK regulation is going. And I think you noted the sort of much more sort of covert alignment or reluctance to de-align or diverge since the new government took office. But obviously this is something where as well there's quite a lot of interest in the US about regulation, not least on areas like tech and things like that, or other barriers to US exports. I mean, does this change the sort of regulatory context for UK operations? How do you see the sort of, UK regulatory policy developing in the light of EU-US competition?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is I think the UK government's instincts are fundamentally much more European than American. You just have to look at this product regulation and metrology bill going through Parliament at the moment, which effectively would allow the UK government to more or less copy EU product safety regulations related to the environmental effects of goods. And the reason for that is partly to avoid new trade barriers, but it's also, I think, quite clearly from reading it, because the government wants to maintain alignment. It doesn't want UK consumers to be exposed to goods which are considered unsafe for the EU market. So, batteries on electric bikes that are prone to spontaneous combustion, or toys that are unsafe for children. I think the instincts of the government are quite interventionist and about upholding consumer standards. And I also think that's where the British public is. If you look at regulation, most people like regulations. They like to ban things. They like to feel like they are protected from certain forces. And so I think that is going to make it challenging to do much at all with the United States, because any kind of meaningful trade deal, which seriously changes the dynamics of trade, involves importing American agri-foods. And that's something which I don't think Labour politicians would be comfortable with, and I don't think it's something voters would be comfortable with, the classic question of chlorinated chicken and things like that. So where is the space? It's probably more in the services sector, in those intangible things that don't touch on people's lives in such a direct way. So whether it's kind of positions for tech companies, what they're allowed to do within our market compared to the EU, maybe there's some flexibility there, but it's kind of marginal. I don't think we're going to see any radical sort of redirection of our regulations towards the US, because I don't think many people want it, to be honest.
And you mentioned security cooperation. Just picking up something, and we've got first comments about, I think that Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, just sort of passed the first stage of Senate confirmation hearings. That's led quite a lot of people to say, can we really share intelligence with somebody who's seen as a sort of, defender of Russian interests, very sort of unsound or whatever? Did you pick up when you were just in Brussels sort of concerns about the existing state of security cooperation with the US, just from a personnel point of view, as well as Trump's skepticism about NATO more generally?
Who's that aimed at?
You.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, there is a conversation going on about what it means to be an ally. I mean, it's quite profound, isn't it? In that sense, because the US isn't acting like an ally. It isn't acting like it believes in any sort of concept of the West. It's acting like a bullying great power that wants to return to spheres of influence. And I think batten down the hatches and hope for the best, which seems to be the sort of existing strategy in Europe and indeed here. It might work, but there's every chance that it won't. I remember actually, you remember when the announcement was made about that Chinese AI that had just been released. I mean, it was a bit of a shocker for me, because my first reaction was a kind of, that'll show Musk and co. And then I stopped myself and thought to myself, oh, hang on a sec, we shouldn't be celebrating the fact that the Chinese are doing well. But the fact of having Trump in the White House and the way he and his acolytes have behaved shapes perceptions quite profoundly. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll shape policy. God knows the Europeans have been talking about autonomy from the US for decades and not got much closer to achieving it. But I think, this time round, there's a real sense about what is the alliance worth if all he does is try and nick bits of territory from allies and levy tariffs on the others.
Interesting. Catherine, got some comments here about the EU disliking the language about resetting. I don't know whether that's something people picked up, whether it translates very badly into all the official languages. But one of the things that the EU keeps on emphasising is that the UK has to be implementing current agreements properly. And that's one of the things that is supposed to be being reviewed in the great TCA review of implementation, if nothing more. Are we actually implementing the agreements properly at the moment? Are there things where there are EU problems? And maybe you could just pick up the fact that the Spanish have said, remember Gibraltar, and just tell us where we are on that, whether we're any closer to an agreement on Gibraltar.
Starting with the last one first, Gibraltar, it's been so difficult to resolve. We've heard on numerous occasions that the deal is almost there, and then it goes completely quiet. And it really is the dog that hasn't barked so far. I think a lot of the problems lie on which police will police the airport, both sides are really struggling with that. But of course that is not part of the TCA or the withdrawal agreement. In respect of the withdrawal agreement, that was the divorce text. Remember, there's not actually that much of the withdrawal agreement left, apart from two important things. One is citizens' rights, and the second one is the Northern Ireland Protocol, now Windsor Framework. There are bits of the Windsor Framework that still haven't been properly implemented in respect to checking, although the UK and Northern Ireland are doing more. In respect of citizens' rights, the EU, somewhat to the surprise of many people, have brought further enforcement proceedings against the UK for non-compliance with the provisions on citizens' rights under the withdrawal agreement. What's very odd, despite an awful lot of asking, a lot of looking, it's very unclear precisely which aspect of citizens' rights we're in breach of. It's well known we were in breach of the withdrawal agreement in respect of the so-called upgrade from pre-settled status to settled status. But our own High Court told the government that, and the government is struggling to deal with the problem, but has put quite a lot of measures in place to try and address that. Some people say what the case is about is non-compliance with EU law during the transition period. That was from January to December 2020. Others say it's about issues over family members. So there was one set of enforcement proceedings started just before Christmas. There's another one about a trade and investment that was started. But that will be it under the withdrawal agreement, under those specific provisions, because they expired at the end of the year, which is why those two cases were rushed out in December. So there is a sense that we are not doing as much as we should, but the fact is there are only two enforcement proceedings, suggests that perhaps we're not doing quite so badly. But it is seen as a question of good faith. And going back to the shopping list of demands, while many people have said they're rather unambitious, you can say they're actually a sensible list, because the UK and the EU are not trying to engage in a quick step, but in fact a very, very carefully choreographed dance which involves trust building. And had the UK gone in and said, well, we want to rejoin the single market and rejoin the customs union, both of which are legally complicated to do, there would have been just a thought of who's going to believe the UK for making such ambitious asks.
Oh, interesting. And just on Northern Ireland, Joel, I've been away, but while I was away, it looked as though there was the first triggering of the so-called Stormont break. And it's quite interesting. Hilary Benn made a speech quite recently about the way in which the government dealt with that, because the government didn't raise that with the EU. Do you want to just talk us through what that might tell us about the way in which the UK is actually managing the current arrangements?
Yeah, it's really interesting. For the sort of uninitiated, the Stormont break is something which allows MPs in Northern Ireland, or MLAs in Northern Ireland, to veto bits of specifically updated pieces of EU legislation that would normally apply in Northern Ireland by default under the Windsor Framework. And this was it was something introduced by the framework and potentially seen as a very powerful tool for Stormont to be able to block and fight back against EU legislation, which it didn't like. Others said actually the bar to using it is very, very high, and in reality, the power is more sort of superficial, symbolic, because actually when you get into it, it's a pretty high threshold for doing it. This case sort of, favors that latter argument and the sign that you can't actually just apply the Stormont break to any piece of legislation you don't like. You're meant to be able to prove a significant disruption to everyday life in a way which is liable to persist. So this break was triggered. Some information was submitted about the reasons why. And in very simple terms, the UK government took a look at it and said, no, like you've not proven that you've reached the threshold for using the break in this way. And so it didn't even refer it to the EU, which is normally what it would do under the break processes. So I think it probably sends a message to MLAs in Stormont that the grounds for using the break have to be significantly stronger and more substantial than the way in which they tried it that time. And I think it is part of a new political context where we now have a UK government which is not dependent on the DUP and unionist parties in the way that the Conservatives were. They're more able to push back and sort of play down this politics of protest. And I think it's also supported by the fact that, broadly speaking, this government is engaging quite constructively on Northern Ireland. And I think they are sincere about trying to minimise future divergence between GB and NI, and about creating a settlement, a political settlement in Northern Ireland that is stable and functional over the medium to long term. And so all those things sort of militate against this kind of reactionary use of the break in the way which was tried here, and could lead to a slightly more measured and considered approach of it in future, maybe.
I mean, it's quite interesting. I thought that Hilary Benn said, actually, the Stormont break did work because although we've not raised it with the EU, we are going to do our bit to make sure that the UK government sort of aligns with Northern Ireland, so there won't be the divergence you were worried about. So that's quite interesting. Whether it's going to use the product regulation and metrology bill, who knows? Anyway, okay, so that's going quite narrowly into it. Let's spend our last few minutes going into the politics of where all this is and how we expect the rest of the year, 2-3 years or whatever, to develop. Anand, you mentioned where the Liberal Democrats are, but we've also seen today reports that there's going to be a group of Labour MPs who are going to be focusing on the threat from reform. So what are the domestic political pressures and how much leeway does Keir Starmer have on this if he could forget about his Trump problem? We obviously realise he's playing about 5-dimensional chess here. But yeah, have the politics changed dramatically on this?
I mean, it's really hard, this, because on the one hand, yes, public opinion has shifted. Yes, more people than ever now say leaving the EU was the wrong decision. As I said before, there are some in the Labour hierarchy who are obsessed with winning back those traditional Labour voters in those leave-leaning red wall seats, which shapes and clouds their thinking. Reform is obviously considered to be a very serious threat by Labour. I wonder sometimes if they're not overdoing it, because they're second by quite a long way in many of those 90-odd seats in which they came second. And actually, those seats are very different demographically. So having a coherent strategy for winning back voters in all of them is going to be very, very difficult. So there is that reform threat, and I think we'll get a slightly clearer answer as to how serious that threat is after the local elections are held. Of course, we don't know exactly which local elections are going to be held yet. And then there's the Liberal Democrats on the other side, trying, I think, to do to Labour from the pro-European side, which Reform are doing from the Brexit side, which is to put pressure on Labour to shift its position and make it move forward. Now, I think the key thing I've learned about this government so far is, firstly, that Europe isn't the priority for them. Fixing the domestic economy is the priority, and Europe isn't seen as a central plank of that strategy. And secondly, by the Product Safety and Metrology Bill, as well as by the absence of a European Scrutiny Committee, one of the objectives seems to be to avoid too much debate about Europe. So Labour want this thing to go forward in a sort of sotto voce sort of way. We'll just mend things as they need mending and not make a big deal out of it. What we don't know is how incensed or otherwise public opinion might become. I mean, the Daily Mail, I think in the last week, has run 2 or 3 splash headlines about us. I think today's was about us crawling back to Brussels. So there is obviously a hope on the right that they can spark outrage because of the emissions ETS alignment and things like that. The honest answer is we don't know how much traction that will get. Remember, for all the shifting public opinion on Brexit, UK-EU relations are a very, very low priority in the minds of the public. I think it's 6 or 7% of the people now, according to the Ipsos Issues Index, who think that UK-EU relations are the single greatest priority facing the country. I'd be surprised if many voters put it amongst the top 5, to be honest. So in that sense, there might be a bit more scope than the simple polling around either reform or more generally on the EU would lead us to believe. I realise that was a very, very waffly answer. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to give Jannike a chance to waffle on about the perspective from Europe now. Jannike, I mean, we've seen quite a lot of sort of, more right-wing populist governments in Europe. Does that make them more Brexit sympathetic and, less caring about showing that Brexit was a failure? Are they interested in cooperation with the UK on illegal migration? I mean, does the UK register at all, or has everybody got so many other concerns that, frankly, the UK's not, slipped out of the in tray rather than just to the bottom of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that the UK isn't a priority for the EU institutions or any of the member states, but that doesn't mean that they aren't open to UK proposals or that they're not interested in closer relations. I think they very much are interested in closer relations. And if you look at the European Commission's kind of political guidelines for the next 5 years, the UK does feature in there, and the topics are security, energy, resilience, and people-to-people links. So those are the areas that I think member states and the EU are interested in fostering closer relations. What doesn't feature is the trading relationship. So I think that's kind of the big difference in between where the UK is at, where there's a feeling that maybe the trade and cooperation agreement has some flaws or it doesn't necessarily work that well for all UK industries. Whilst on the EU side, there's a feeling, well, actually, this is quite a good agreement for us and we'd be kind of happy with the status quo on trade. But there are other areas, given the changed geopolitical environment, where we'd like closer relations. So I think it's just a question of how all of this is packaged in a deal in the coming months. I think that the summit in May is probably going to be an important moment where we kind of want to learn more about what are the areas where there's actually a common understanding between the EU and the UK, where both sides want to actually take this forward and enter into negotiations. But as Catherine said earlier, I think this is going to be a very slow process of recalibrating a relationship that's been through some very difficult years and where there's still some trust building to be done. So maybe we will enter into some official negotiations kind of in the second half of this year. I mean, the EU has said they are open to talk about SPS, so I'm sure that will form part of it. But so will the EU's asks on youth mobility and on fisheries. So I think it's going to be quite a bumpy ride. But it will take time. I mean, if you look also at the Swiss example, the EU just concluded a new deal with Switzerland in December last year, and that was also a very difficult and long process. I mean, they had negotiated the institutional framework agreement in 2021, which was then rejected by Switzerland. Then negotiations were on hold for a few years. Then they agreed a common understanding last year, and then on the basis of that, they negotiated from March until December 2024. And now this still has to be ratified. So I think these things take time. And what's different to the TCA negotiations from 2020 is that this time there is not this threat of a no deal. So there is kind of the status quo, and the status quo works quite well for the EU. So I think if it turns out that things are too difficult and it's too difficult to find common ground, then I think there is also a possibility of failure in some of these areas.
So we've talked about resetting, I'm just going to use that horrible word, relations with the EU, but one of the things that Brexit has done is put particular pressure on relations within the UK. We've seen things like the UK Internal Market Act being introduced, which I think is now up for review. Do we get any sense that the new government, the Labour government, is involving the devolves in a different way? Is it managing those relations better? Exactly how is that all playing out? Or Catherine?
I think it's better than it was before, because it couldn't have been much worse. Under Boris Johnson, it was dire. There's a very good chapter by Dan Wincott in our report on the Brexit files about the devolution issue. And his essential argument was that Boris Johnson was determined to engage in muscular unionism, which essentially meant trampling all over the devolveds. And we saw that concretely through the fact that all of the devolves denied consent to all of the major pieces of Brexit legislation. The Internal Market Bill Now Act had to be put in place to try and help manage relations between the, essentially England, Wales and Scotland, in order to try and ensure that goods could move freely. But it essentially favoured the dominant party, because we have such an asymmetrical union, with England being so large and dominant as compared to Wales and Scotland, large and dominant both numerically in terms of population, but also economically. What's interesting is at the first time it's been really seriously put to use, which has been over deposit return schemes, and specifically whether they should include glass bottles or just plastic bottles. It has been found to be seriously wanting. And so the government has brought forward the review of the Internal Market Act by at least 6 months, in order to be able to ensure that a scheme, which I think most people think would be a good thing, can actually get up and running. Now, whether that means relations are better, I think they are probably will be better, just built into the fact that you don't have central government shouting abuse, both literally and metaphorically, at the devolves.
Anand, we had a bit of a change of personnel at the top of doing all of this. We've got Ollie Robbins now running the Foreign Office, who negotiated Theresa May's unsuccessful withdrawal deal. We've got Michael Ellam, regarded as a big catch within government, tempted back from HSBC to be second permanent secretary in the Cabinet Office in charge. I know you're always very interested in machinery of government changes. So I just wondered if you'd like to just reflect on whether there's a sign that the UK is now getting its act together better to coordinate, and whether these changes that we're looking, I mean, do they raise eyebrows in Brussels with people when you were hobnobbing, when you were spotted at the ambassador's reception yesterday? Do we get a sense that the UK now has got its top team in place to do this all?
I anticipated that you'd do something like this to me, Jill. I'm just slightly relieved you didn't do it with the UK Internal Market Act. So this is a slightly less of a hospital pass than that would have been. It's good that the people in place. I mean, what I would say is I'm amazed that it's taken so long for Ellam to be appointed. That seemed like a gaping hole in the government for the best part of 6 or 7 months. I'm not sure it arouses that much interest in the European Union, except that they know who they should talk to. What I would add is I still think number 10 just feels really, really strangely underpowered to me, that there isn't an economic person there. There's no replacement for John Bew there. There's no European person there. And I mean, personally, I think number 10 should be beefed up a bit to provide some leadership and direction across the whole swathe of government policy. But is it an improvement to have these people in place? Yeah, absolutely. You've got good professional people in to do these roles. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the government to make its mind up. Nothing changes that. You know, Michael Ellam could be Superman, but unless the government decides what it wants, in what order, and what it's willing to give to get it, we're not going to move forward. But having someone that the EU can talk to about this as a point of contact, I think, is definitely progress.
Okay, last couple of minutes. I just want you all to take a couple of sentences each. This time next year, if we're doing this lunch hour, what will we have to show for a year of talking? Joël.
I was hoping I wouldn't be first, so I had some time to think. I think we will probably be mid-negotiation on a few economic measures which have been sort of brought out over the first half of this year. And I suspect we'll be saying it's all too slow, unsurprisingly bogged down in technical intricacies. This isn't going to get done for another year or two. Government won't see the political benefits for the election, but they'll take all of the political pain of having sort of aligned with the EU in some sectors. That would be my guess.
Okay, Catherine.
Yeah, I agree. I think there will be continued greater alignment. I think there'll be greater pragmatism. I'm slightly more optimistic that we will have something to show from the summit on the 19th of May, because the way the machinery works is that now there's a deadline. It means that both sides will line their folk up, and so that they can have a communique that says that something has been done. There is expectations on both sides, and if the UK and the EU can't agree anything at all, what hope is there for them to be able to take a common position in respect of Trump and indeed the other issues, of course, Putin and what's going on in China?
Jannike.
So I think this time next year, we might well have some sort of kind of joint non-binding declaration on foreign policy, security and defense. That might not necessarily go into a lot of detail when it comes to some of the more difficult defense industrial questions, but I think there might be some kind of high-level ambitions that are outlined in there, maybe similar to what the EU has got with Norway. I think they might still front-load security issues, even though it will be part of a package deal, but I think that doesn't mean that you can't kind of discuss some of the priority issues first. So I do assume that this time next year there will be something on this area, and I agree with the others that trade is going to be much slower and more difficult.
And final word, Anand.
Yeah, I agree with that. There'll be a security deal and ongoing negotiations on the economics. The one variable that hasn't been mentioned is if Reform do spectacularly well in the local elections that we're having in May and win a potential by-election that's coming up, that might make the government even more cautious than it's already been.
Okay, well, on that slightly downbeat note, well, no, some progress, but whatever, that things may have not progressed inordinately over the next year, then I'm going to close this discussion. Thank you all very much for listening in, and thanks particularly to Jannike, Catherine, Joel, and Anand, and see you all soon. Thanks very much, and do check out our big Brexit files from referendum to research, sorry, that word again, which Anand's just showing you and is available on our website. If you come by our office, we've probably got a mountain of printed copies as well. Anyway, see you all soon. Thanks very much for joining.